10 days. That's all it took. The largest military machine ever assembled on this planet launched nearly 1,000 strikes, lit the Persian Gulf on fire, killed a supreme leader in his own capital, and then, quietly, without cameras, without fanfare, the President of the United States picked up a telephone and dialed Moscow. Not the other way around. Washington called the Kremlin. And that one detail, that single fact about who dialed who, tells you more about where this war is actually going than every Pentagon briefing combined. So sit down, because what I'm about to walk you through will fundamentally change how you understand this conflict. Let's rewind to February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel simultaneously launched what the Pentagon designated Operation Epic Fury. In a 12-hour window, roughly 900 precision strikes rained down across Iranian territory. The two Spirit stealth bombers that cost $2 billion each sliced through Iranian airspace undetected. The 52 Stratofortresses, aircraft older than most of the pilots flying them, unleashed carpet patterns of GPS-guided munitions. F-35 Lightning jets provided suppression cover. And from warships positioned across the Persian Gulf, Tomahawk cruise missiles streaked toward military installations, command bunkers, radar stations, and nuclear enrichment facilities. It was the single most concentrated display of American air power in the Middle East since the United States rolled into Baghdad in 2003. And within the opening hours, something happened that reshuffled the entire geopolitical deck. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Not captured, not wounded, eliminated, alongside dozens of senior military and political officials, in a strike so precise that American intelligence had clearly been planning it for months, possibly years. The logic behind the operation was clean, almost surgical in its simplicity. Remove the head and the body folds. The Iranian population, already seething after years of brutal government crackdowns that had killed thousands of protesters in the streets, would see this moment and rise. The regime, leaderless and broken, would collapse inward, and the whole thing would wrap up fast. President Trump reinforced this narrative personally. He described the entire operation to reporters as a short-term excursion. His energy secretary went further, posting on social media that an American naval vessel had already escorted a commercial oil tanker safely through the Strait of Hormuz, signaling to markets and to the world that this disruption would be temporary, manageable, controlled. For a brief, shimmering moment, the markets believed it. Oil futures actually dipped. Investors exhaled. And then the White House had to retract everything. The Navy had not escorted any tanker. The strait was not open. The post was deleted, and 11 days later, the war had not ended. It had metastasized. Because here is what that elegant theory completely failed to account for. Iran is not Iraq. Within hours of those opening American strikes, before the dust had even settled over Tehran, Iranian ballistic missiles were already in the air. Not a symbolic volley, not a face-saving gesture, a sustained, coordinated barrage arcing across the Persian Gulf and slamming into targets across 6 different countries: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan. Every single one of those nations hosts American military personnel. Every single one of those nations was told, explicitly or implicitly, that Washington would manage the consequences of this operation. And every single one of them watched Iranian warheads fall on or near their soil within the first day. But the missiles were not even the main weapon. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made one announcement that carried more destructive economic force than every bomb the United States had dropped. They declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Not threatened, not contested, closed. A senior IRGC naval commander addressed the global shipping industry directly and stated that any vessel attempting to transit the waterway would be, in his words, set ablaze. Now, if you do not fully understand why that single declaration changed the trajectory of this entire conflict, let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are staggering. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that sliver of water, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil move every single day. That represents approximately one-fifth of the entire world's daily oil consumption, passing through a choke point narrow enough that you can practically see the Iranian coastline from the other side. When those tankers stopped moving, when global insurance underwriters pulled their war risk coverage and shipping companies decided that no cargo premium was worth an anti-ship missile through the hull, the price of crude oil did something that veteran energy traders described as unprecedented at this velocity. It went vertical. Brent crude, the international pricing benchmark used by most of the planet, surged past $130 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate, the American domestic benchmark, spiked 40% in a single week. Standard & Poor's Global Market Intelligence tracked vessel transits through the strait and documented a 95% collapse. Before the war, approximately 160 commercial vessels passed through every week. In the first full week of March, 55 made it through. At American gas stations, pump prices climbed 17% in 11 days. Energy analysts projected that if the strait remained effectively sealed, diesel fuel, the lifeblood of American trucking, agriculture, and manufacturing, could reach between $4.50 and $5 per gallon. And then Saudi Aramco, the single largest oil-producing enterprise on Earth, whose leadership chooses every public word with extreme care, used a phrase that sent shockwaves through global energy markets. They described the situation using the words catastrophic consequences. That is not commentary. That is not opinion. That is the corporation responsible for stabilizing global oil supply telling the world, in plain language, that the system is breaking. And this is the context, this economic earthquake, that explains what happened on March 9, 2026. The White House initiated a phone call to the Kremlin. I need you to absorb the weight of that sentence. Washington placed the call. The Kremlin confirmed this detail publicly, almost immediately, which is itself significant. Moscow wanted the world to know that America came to Russia, not the reverse. Trump's communications team attempted to frame it as a routine diplomatic check-in, a standard conversation between two world leaders. Nothing unusual. But examine the surrounding facts and that framing disintegrates. Trump had not spoken with Vladimir Putin since December of 2025. 3 months of silence. No calls during Christmas. No calls during the New Year. No calls during January or February. Then, precisely 10 days into a Middle East conflict that was hemorrhaging American credibility, bleeding American treasure at a rate of billions per week, killing American soldiers, and detonating the global oil market, suddenly, urgently. The President of the United States needed to hear Vladimir Putin's voice. That is not routine. That is a leader searching for a lifeline. Yuri Ushakov, the Kremlin's senior foreign policy advisor, briefed Russian media afterward with unusual candor. He described the conversation as frank, businesslike, and lasting approximately 1 hour. He stated that Putin presented a series of proposals aimed at achieving a rapid political and diplomatic resolution to the conflict, proposals that had been developed following recent direct conversations between Putin and Gulf state leaders, as well as with Iran's newly installed leadership. Ushakov then added a sentence that diplomats and intelligence analysts around the world immediately flagged. He said the call had been, quote, very substantial and would undoubtedly carry practical significance. In the coded vocabulary of Kremlin communications, that phrasing means something concrete was discussed. Something was tentatively agreed upon. Or at minimum, a framework was established that both sides intend to build on. Hours later, Trump addressed reporters in Florida. His tone was noticeably different from the chest-thumping bravado of the war's opening days. He described it as a very good call. He claimed Putin was very impressed by what the American military had accomplished. He predicted the war would conclude very soon. And then came the reveal. When a reporter asked about Putin's offer to assist in mediating the Iran conflict, Trump pivoted and said something that made every foreign policy professional in Washington sit up straight. He said, quote, I told him, you can be more helpful by ending the war in Ukraine. Read that statement again. Slowly. The President of the United States, currently prosecuting a war he initiated, is offering to accelerate negotiations on Ukraine, a conflict where Russia currently holds battlefield momentum and territorial gains, in exchange for Putin's assistance in finding an exit from the Iran situation. That is not diplomacy. That is a transaction. And the exchange rate tells you exactly who has leverage and who does not. The Kremlin confirmed that during the same phone call, Putin provided Trump with a detailed briefing on Russian military progress in Ukraine, which Putin characterized as proceeding with considerable success. Moscow was not being subtle. That was a reminder. A polite, deliberate reminder of who holds the stronger hand in Eastern Europe. And Washington, rather than pushing back, rather than challenging that characterization, listened. Vladimir Putin entered that phone call carrying three distinct forms of leverage, and he knew it. First, Ukraine. Russia controls significant portions of eastern and southern Ukraine. Western support for Kiev has been fracturing for months. European ammunition stockpiles are depleted, and Trump, who has signaled repeatedly that he wants the Ukraine situation resolved quickly, now needs something from Putin. That transforms Ukraine from a liability for Moscow into a bargaining chip. Second, Iran. Russia maintains direct diplomatic channels with Tehran's new leadership. Putin spoke with Iranian officials in the days before the Trump call. He has relationships, intelligence, and influence that Washington simply does not possess with the current Iranian government. If there is going to be a negotiated end to this conflict, Putin is one of the very few people on Earth who can actually deliver Iranian participation. Third, and perhaps most consequentially, oil. Every single day that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or restricted, Russian oil becomes more valuable. China and India, the two largest emerging market energy consumers on the planet, are already pivoting their purchasing toward Russian crude, which flows through pipelines and Arctic shipping routes completely unaffected by the Gulf disruption. Russia's energy revenues are climbing precisely because of the chaos that American military action created. Putin is not merely a potential peacemaker in this scenario. He is actively profiting from every additional day the conflict continues. This is the paradox that the White House is now trapped inside. The person they need to help end the war is the same person who benefits most from the war continuing. Meanwhile, against every assumption baked into the original American war plan, Iran has not collapsed. Mojtaba Khamenei, the hardline son of the assassinated supreme leader, has been installed as his father's successor. Not a reformer, not a moderate, a man whose entire political identity is built on confrontation with the West and ideological rigidity. If the White House believed that killing Ali Khamenei would produce a leadership vacuum, they miscalculated. It produced a leadership hardening. Iran's parliament speaker posted a public statement declaring unequivocally that Iran is not seeking a ceasefire. Iran's foreign minister stated on the record that his country remains fully prepared to continue launching missiles for as long as the situation demands. And Iran's senior national security official delivered a message aimed squarely at President Trump, saying, quote, "Even those bigger than you could not eliminate Iran." That is a reference to decades of failed attempts by multiple American administrations, to the Iran-Iraq War where 1 million people died and Iran still did not surrender, to sanctions regimes that crippled the economy but never broke the state. The Pentagon has pointed to one statistic as evidence of progress. Admiral Brad Cooper reported a 90% decline in Iranian ballistic missile launches compared to the opening days of the conflict. The official interpretation is that American strikes have significantly degraded Iran's launch capabilities. But there is a second interpretation, and it is the one keeping military strategists awake at night. Iran may be rationing. Rather than expending its remaining missile inventory in a concentrated burst that would temporarily grab headlines but leave nothing in reserve, Iran may be deliberately pacing its fire, conserving its remaining assets for a protracted engagement, spacing launches to maintain psychological pressure while preserving the capability for sustained operations over weeks or months. That is not the behavior of a country on the verge of surrender. That is the behavior of a country settling in for a long fight. A country that has calculated, correctly or not, that time is on its side, that every day the war continues, American fuel prices climb, American public patience erodes, and American political pressure on the White House intensifies. And Iran is not fighting alone. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon has launched fresh rocket volleys into northern Israel. Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq have publicly declared their readiness to enter the conflict directly. The multi-front scenario that American military planners warned would be the worst-case outcome is materializing in real time. The toll of the first 11 days demands acknowledgement. More than 1,200 people have been killed in Iran. Over 570 have died in Lebanon. 14 civilians are dead in Israel, and 7 American service members have lost their lives, including Sergeant Benjamin Pennington, a soldier assigned to an Army space battalion who was killed when an Iranian missile struck a military installation in Kuwait. More than 140 American troops have been wounded. The Pentagon spent $5 billion on munitions in just the first 48 hours of the campaign. The administration has since declined to provide updated cost figures to Congress, which tells you everything about the trajectory of that number. These are not abstractions. These are human beings, families destroyed, communities shattered, and the question that hangs over all of it, the question no one in Washington seems willing to answer directly, is whether any of this was necessary and whether any of it is achieving its stated objectives. So where does this go? The most probable path forward, the one that the Putin phone call is quietly constructing the foundation for, is an American withdrawal disguised as a triumph. Watch for the sequence. It will follow a pattern. First, the Pentagon will announce the successful destruction of key Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities. This will be framed as the permanent elimination of Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon. Second, the administration will highlight the decimation of Iran's conventional navy and the severe degradation of its ballistic missile infrastructure. Third, Trump will appear before cameras and declare that the mission's core objectives have been accomplished, that American military power has achieved what diplomacy could not, that Iran has been set back by decades. He will use the language of completion, of finality, of victory, and behind the scenes, the deal being quietly assembled will look something like this. Trump terminates active military operations against Iran on terms he can present to his political base as an unqualified success. Iran's regime, battered and bleeding but structurally intact, gets to tell its own population that it absorbed the full fury of the American and Israeli militaries and remained standing. That narrative, the narrative of survival as victory, is extremely powerful in Iranian political culture. It worked after the Iran-Iraq War, and it will work again. Putin, who facilitated the diplomatic off-ramp, collects on that favor when the conversation pivots back to Ukraine. Moscow gets movement on a settlement framework that reflects Russian territorial gains. American pressure on Russia softens, sanctions discussions stall, and Russian oil revenue, inflated by months of Gulf disruption, continues to flow at elevated levels for as long as global energy markets remain unsettled. Everyone gets something they can call a win, except perhaps the people of Iran who buried their dead, the families of American soldiers who received folded flags, the people of Lebanon who are once again rebuilding from rubble, and the people of Ukraine whose leverage just got traded away in a phone call they were not part of. The architecture of the deal that will eventually end this war is being assembled right now. The blueprints are being drawn, not in the Oval Office, not in the Pentagon, and not in Tehran. They are being drawn in Moscow. And the most revealing detail remains the one we started with. Washington placed the call. In diplomacy, in negotiation, in every human interaction involving power, the person who picks up the phone first is the person who needs something more. 10 days ago, the United States launched the most devastating air campaign in 20 years and believed it would produce a rapid surrender. Instead, it produced a phone call to the one man on Earth positioned to profit from every possible outcome. The war of bombs may belong to Washington, but the war of time, the war of leverage, the war that actually determines how this ends and what comes after, that war is being won somewhere else entirely. This story is developing fast. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss a single update as the next chapter of this crisis unfolds. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.